Hi students, welcome back to online video lectures of computer vision. In the last Zoom session, we had a detailed discussion about cameras and images, and in this current video, the purpose of it is to give you some clarifications about the questions, some of the key questions that have been raised by some of you students, right? So at the end of this talk, you will be answering by the way in this talk five questions related to the earlier class. First, what is the purpose of a lens? Then what it means by a circle of confusion, or why we call it as a circle of confusion when there is a blurring in certain regions. Why do we call that as a circle of confusion? Third question would be how to interpret the F number, and fourth question would be how depth of the field and aperture size are related. Okay, and finally, why does dolly zoom brings perspective distortions? Okay, we will go one by one. So the first question is, what is the purpose of a lens? Okay, if I have to answer it shortly, for two reasons. The first one being to gather more light. Okay, second one is to control the focus of the object of interest. Let me give you a bit more detailed answer here. This is what happens with a pinhole camera. We have discussed it in detail, right? Depending on the distance between this pinhole and the screen, and this pinhole and the object, proportionately the object gets formed on the back of on the screen, let's say, and then the size is dependent on these ratios, right? This is what we have discussed, and of course the image will be inverted here. Then we discussed about what happens if your pinhole camera is not really a pinhole, is not just only a single point but has some length. So that time we discussed that if the length is large, okay, is take an object point here, this contributes to multiple locations here, okay, more than one sensor location here on the screen. Similarly, an object which is next to it would also contribute to the same locations here where this actual object point is contributing to, and thereby resulting in a blurry image, right? Because the same information in the neighborhood is present in is contributing to all from the neighborhood, or all those points are contributing here at a given point, right? So that's kind of a blurred thing is there. So what's the solution to get rid of that? Well, what you could do is you make the pinhole very small, right? And then what's the issue with that? We discussed it. Like, for example, the amount of light that enters into it, okay, causing that image was reduced. First point. Second point, you cannot go on reducing it further and further to a smaller value. The reason being, then when it is small below a threshold, then the diffraction effects also would come into picture, optical diffraction, and that again causing you a blurring effect, right? So what could be done? Suppose now, so you have a very small, a moderate hole, okay, a hole of moderate size could give you a good thing, but what could happen is the amount of light might not be there. Another thing is you don't have a control over focusing this light. So you do the lens, for example, that in between, okay, in the middle you consider it as a lens. One thing, all the rays of light coming from this object point are getting focused onto the one point, right? So focusing, right? So sharp focus, okay. And then it's not just a single line ray of light that is contributing here, but all multiple rays of light depending on the diameter of your lens are all contributing here. So you have much more light and sharp focus, right? And yeah, this is, for example, a freestanding room-sized camera obscura, they call it pinhole camera. Okay, at University of London, the setup looks like this, where in this red box you could see a hole here, so that makes a picture. So I guess inside you will have a screen upon which in this dark room where this will be projected, right? I'm just showing you the same example that we have seen in the last Zoom session. Say, for example, you are shrinking the aperture size from when you are having a aperture size of 2 mm, for example. This is how the image would look like, where there is a blurring effect because each sensor pixel or a sensor location or a pixel is getting contributions from multiple neighboring pixels, right? And you reduce the aperture size, you get a good image, but it doesn't mean you keep on decreasing, you would get such a sharp image, because then the optical diffraction effects would come into picture, right? And then, since anyway we thought about the lens is something now depending on the focal length, the distance from the lens to the screen where you are projecting, and from the lens, okay, center of that lens to the object, okay. By varying your focal length or one of these two distances, you could decide on where exactly in your 3D you could project, because it's after all we are smashing the whole 3D onto a 2D surface essentially. So that's the example showing, illustrating you the effect of focus that you could get by varying either the focal length of your lens or focal, which you would not be obtaining. That control is not there when you are using pinhole. Only way you could do is there are only two parameters there: distance from the object to your hole, and from the hole to the screen. Unless you vary these two, you won't really figure out or tweak which needs to get focused. On the other hand, if you have a lens, just like the way in our eye, okay, depending on where we are looking at, the inside the lens is getting either thin, okay, or the focal length, in other words the focal length is varying, and thereby focusing on where you would like to see, right? So that's that. And then we'll move on to the second question that on a few students have raised. So when you have a lens, right, and assume that you are looking at various distances where it is getting focused for a given focal length, okay, and for a given distance from the focal length, let's say, to the screen, there is only a particular point in this distance, okay, you consider this as your x-axis gets focused here, and anything closer than that or farther than that would result in something called as an effect like this. That point would eventually result or contribute to multiple points here on the screen. So this is referred to as a circle of confusion, and we were going to see why it's called so. You could see here, when you have a lens, the whole the light coming out of it would form like a cone beam, okay, of light. So that if you are just taking that getting projected at the vertex, okay, then you have a point, but after at that point converging, then it will again keep diverging. So if you take any sample of that light, either before this convergence or after this convergence, in other words equivalent to the light coming from a position, 3D position, which is either closer than that or farther than that point, would eventually, you are taking a like a snapshot or projection of your beam of cone, okay, the beam forming the cone shaped beam, either before or after that vertex, which in 2D, if you look at it in 2D, that would essentially form you a circle. And that's the reason this is blurred. You don't really know where exactly that point contribute and doesn't contribute, gets focused here, so there is a confusion here, and then this is forming a circle, so you call it as a circle of confusion. So that's the reason why you would call it as a circle of confusion, right? We'll move on to the third question that has been raised in the Zoom session, as what exactly is that Fnumber, okay, that we have seen while characterizing the what is the focal length of your lens. So basically Fnumber would give you the ratio of the focal length, okay, to the diameter of clear aperture. Pay attention to here, clear aperture is because when you have a camera, just like you with the pupil, depending on the amount of light entering, would change its aperture, either close it down or increase it. Similar manual adjustment in most of the places you have, whereby you could control the aperture that you allow there, okay. So depending on that, you could define the Fnumber. It essentially would give you the ratio of the focal length of your lens that is there, okay, it's fixed where it gets converged, right? All the parallel rays, the point of convergence, that distance is the focal length, and the diameter of your lens. These are that ratio is this, and people usually express it as f by, okay. For example, take an example here to make things much clear. Assume that a length has a focal length, a lens has a focal length of 10 mm, okay, and the diameter is 5 mm, then your f number is 2. So that you would express as writing f by 2, okay. Now this would also be helpful for you to know what's the diameter of your aperture. If you know the focal length, see, the diameter is something you have a control over changing it, right? So if I tell you that it is f by 2 is the diameter that you are using, and if you know this is 10 mm is the focal length, you could then say 10 by 2, then 5 mm is the diameter. So f by 2 you could also interpret conveniently as f, you substitute what's the value of your focal length of your lens, that would give you the diameter of your clear aperture, okay. Hope that is clear. In other words, also see that this is in the so if your this number which is there, okay, is large, that means your aperture is small. So f by any value, that value being small means your aperture is high, and vice versa, okay. This is what you could see here. One more interesting thing here to observe, this essentially diagram of decreasing apertures. You are decreasing the apertures of your lens, okay, of your apertures. So increasing the that's equivalent to increasing your f numbers, and each aperture has half the light gathering area of the previous one. So well, this is pi r square is the area, right? You assume that the diameter, so this is something that characterizes diameter for a given f value, keeping the same focal length, same lens means f is fixed. So you could see here r square. So well, this, if you want to take half of the area, right, so that means r square, okay. So that would, you could easily do a very simple math here and figure out that f by 1.4, of course this should be root 2, so 1.414 is probably the right number there. So that you multiply, so this is essentially having this area of, like, it's not scaling in terms of the diameters, but this scaling is in terms of the area representing the amount of light that's entering inside and falling on your lens. So this is 1.4, that's why you could see here 2 times that will give 2.8, 2 times that will give you 5.6, and 2 you skip 1, so 2 times that would give you 4, and that other one would give you 8. So these are those, so don't be puzzled that these numbers look a bit strange. Why 2.84, not simple 234? This is the reason behind that. So essentially each aperture has half the light gathering area of the previous one, okay. And of course this is how it looks like if you had seen the cameras there. So you have a control where you change this, okay. You also have a number there indicating how much aperture you are using, and that's what you would essentially be changing, okay. With that we are done with the first 3 questions, and the next one is how is depth of field and aperture size are related, okay. So if I change, in other words, what is in focus, suppose I am changing the aperture size, okay. The aperture size we just now seen, f by 1.4, f by 2 and those things. So if I am changing that, what is it in focus, how is it going to change? In other words, is it like when I have a small aperture, my depth of field, by depth of field what do we mean by that? Those range of heights or depths that are clearly visible or reasonably visible, okay, that's you consider it as the depth of field. So you could see here this you have a small aperture, for example, then what would happen here? The amount of light hitting here would be small on the lens. So this assume that in the middle there is a sensor here, so the angle of this cone of beam is small, and if you are allowing a particular angle from here, you take the same angle in both cases and see within that this is acceptable range where the blurring, essentially the more the angle is there, you look at the circle of confusion, you take a cross section at any point, and that area would give you the amount of blur degree, or the scale at which the blur is more. That circle of confusion, it's blurrier and you can't see much there. So you could see here, for a given lens and for a given distance between the lens and the sensor and other parameters, you could see that when there is a small aperture, okay, for the same angle, if you take this brown region before and after that, screen or sensor, whatever you call it, is going to give you the acceptable range. And if you take the same angle, so you could see here the acceptable range is more when you have a small aperture. So you have a camera, you reduce the aperture, that means the depth which you could perceive clearly, the range of depth that you could perceive reasonably well would increase while you are decreasing your aperture, while you are decreasing your aperture diameter or the size of your aperture, whatever you call it. Okay, this was the example that we have seen in the earlier one. I'm taking again back here. So you could see here this first diagram, you have a aperture is large, you had only over one, you could see there is a flower plant. Beyond that there is a lot of background of trees there, and you could see here when you make the aperture small, you could see the background also well in the second one. But of course, when if you are more interested on that on those flowers, then perhaps you just want to blur the background and get even a finer details within a small variations of the depth, then you would go for an aperture size of larger size. Okay, and then of course the second issue, when you are reducing your aperture size, of course your depth of field would increase, but a consequence of that is amount of light passing through your and hitting the lens is reducing, right? So you perhaps have to increase your exposure time in order to get a clear picture. Okay, so this is another example showing you we have seen the aperture size, this f by, you just focus on the second numbers here after this at the rate. You could see here 3 point, you are in, these numbers are increasing, that means aperture is coming down. So as the aperture is coming down, you could see that the depth of field, that means the range of, see there is these leaves are hanging or are there, beyond that there are a lot of trees. So that the whole thing, the depth is more clearly visible when you have a low aperture size. But on the other hand, the first picture you could see your those leaves much more clearly. So for example, if you are going to take a portrait of yourself, okay, using a good camera, then you would perhaps go for a small aperture size, okay, so that you get your face clear and the rest would just simply get blurred. But on the other hand, if you are taking a photo of a whole landscape and you want those details also to come out nicely, okay, reasonably well, then you would perhaps go for a camera with a higher value of aperture size. Okay, yes, hope that's clear. And the last question that we are going to take a look at is, we have studied and looked at dolly zoom in the last session. Okay, so one thing that was not very clear to some of you is why is it causing a perspective distortion in the face. So you could see this effect could come in different ways, right? For example, you are changing the focal length of your lens, okay, and then accordingly, suppose you are increasing your focal length, you take it back and make sure that it occupies, your object of interest occupies the same space, or else you keep the same length but you move back and forth and then accordingly zoom in and zoom out. Okay, that's what, and then in a way that you get the same space occupied. So in both these scenarios, you would end up with some perspective distortions in the face, you could see. So why is it so? That which is not very intuitive for some of you. So for that, what I'll do here is I found a good video done in a slightly different context than what we are looking at right now, but should answer this question, but the explanation was very lucid there. Okay, with so that I'm sharing the screen now, and let me go there, and hopefully I have it here.
Hello,
No, sorry, not this one. Let me just pause it and come back and play that video. Yeah, let me come back now here to the video that I was talking of, right? So let me go into a full screen mode. This is something in a slightly different context this is explained, but this should answer you why you would get a perspective distortion, okay? Either while you are moving your camera and then accordingly zooming, or changing your focal length and moving, but still maintaining the same space or proportion of your
Perspective
space.
distortion does exist. Let's say that this first shot that I took of Patrick, I'm approximately 1 foot away from his face. But let's say I'm 50 feet away from the gazebo behind him. As I move back just 1 foot away from Patrick's face, now instead of 1 foot, I'm 2 feet away, Patrick's head size in relation to the frame will drop 50%. It will be half the size as it was. But the gazebo is remaining approximately the same size, because for me to half the size of the gazebo, I would have to move 50 feet back. Now, as I keep moving back, once I actually hit 50 feet away from where I started, the gazebo is now half the size, but Patrick is 50 times smaller. So the animation that I created is a little misleading, because it appears that Patrick is remaining the same size while the gazebo is growing, but in reality what's happening is both the gazebo and Patrick are shrinking down. Patrick is just shrinking down at a much faster rate, and then we're zooming in or cropping in to compensate for that. The relationship between your camera, your subject, and the background is what's creating this perspective distortion or warping. Now, the same thing that's happening with Patrick and his relation to the gazebo behind him is also happening on his face. You'll notice in the first few shots where I'm very close to him, his nose looks gigantic and his ears look really small. And that's because the distance from his nose to the camera is exponentially closer than from his ears to the camera. So now I want to prove this to you in one other way. So we're going to actually do the opposite. I'm going to try to get a wide angle looking shot by...
Yeah, this is sufficient here for our purpose in the current context. I'll stop here. Hope that has answered you why there is a perspective distortion, right? Why there is a perspective distortion when you are changing either your focal length, and accordingly of course the angle of view would change when you are changing the others, and accordingly you are, let's say if you are increasing the focal length, okay, then you are increasing the distance and zooming in, okay, or you could have done the same thing with the same focal length, but you move back, okay, you change the distance, right, and then do that out, okay. That hope it's clear. So yeah, that's all for now. Hope things are clear. Anyway, the YouTube video, I'll give you the link in the description section of this YouTube video, so you go to it for more details, and that's all for now. Okay, thanks for watching. See you in the next class. Bye, take care.